Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. In today's real-life ghost story, we unravel a chilling mystery on a newly opened flight route to New Zealand. Mysterious sightings, eerie events, and a ghostly figure waiting at the airport bus stop. Can you handle the terror? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more haunted encounters and spine-chilling tales. The opening of a new flight route marked both a fresh challenge and opportunity, especially for Jack Smith. As the captain of this route, nearing 50 years old with almost 3 decades of flying experience, Jack had weathered countless storms and completed numerous flight missions without fear. Yet, something about this new route filled him with a vague unease, as if something was bound to happen. This flight would take them from a bustling city airport to distant New Zealand. It was the airline's first time launching this long-awaited route. On board were 12 crew members, each filled with anticipation and excitement. New Zealand's stunning scenery had long been a global tourist destination, and for the crew, having a few days of leisure after the flight was an exciting prospect. Jack stood at the cockpit window, watching the ground crew as they busily prepared the plane. His thoughts were scattered. His co-pilot, Karen Blair, entered, breaking his reverie. "Jack, are you ready? Everyone's in place, and we can begin boarding," Karen said, full of energy, her usual optimism shining through. Jack turned and smiled slightly. "Yeah, Karen, I'm ready, but don't you feel like something's not quite right?" Karen chuckled. "You always feel that way, Jack. Every time we start a new route, you get this feeling, but everything turns out fine in the end. Today will be no different." Jack nodded. While he didn't fully agree with her, he didn't say more. Together, they walked to the boarding gate, ready to embark on the long-haul flight. Everything seemed normal during the flight. The plane soared smoothly through the sky, with passengers resting or enjoying the service provided by the crew. Emily Walker, one of the flight attendants, was busy moving between passengers, ensuring their needs were met. "It's such a lovely flight," Emily said to her colleague, John Davis. "Once we get to New Zealand, we'll finally have a few days to relax." John, who was new to the crew, smiled. "I've heard New Zealand's scenery is incredible. I can't wait to explore." Emily nodded and continued her work. The cabin was calm and peaceful, with passengers immersed in the thought of their upcoming destination. However, Jack still felt uneasy in the cockpit. His fingers tapped lightly on the control stick, and his eyes flicked to the various instruments on the panel. Even though everything looked perfectly normal, he glanced out the window, where the clear blue sky and fluffy clouds stretched endlessly. After a long flight, the plane landed smoothly at New Zealand's airport. Passengers disembarked, thanking the crew for their service. The crew breathed a sigh of relief, finally able to look forward to their short vacation. The air in New Zealand was fresh and cool, with bright sunlight. After completing their post-flight duties, the crew checked into a hotel arranged by the airline. They planned to embark on a road trip the next morning to explore the beautiful country. That evening, they gathered around a long table at the hotel restaurant, enjoying a relaxed atmosphere. Though Jack joined in the conversations and laughter, a nagging sense of unease lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was watching them from the shadows. Karen noticed his silence and asked quietly, "Jack, you've been acting off today. Are you still worried about the flight?" Jack frowned slightly and shook his head. "Maybe, I don't know. I just have this feeling like something's going to happen." Karen patted his shoulder reassuringly. "Don't worry, we made it safely. Tomorrow's going to be a great day." Jack nodded and forced a smile, but deep inside, the heavy feeling remained. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, and the air was filled with the refreshing scent of nature. The crew excitedly departed the hotel, ready to start their road trip. They split into 2 rental cars, each carrying 5 people, while the manager stayed behind at the hotel. The scenery along the road unfolded like a painting. Lush mountains, crystal-clear lakes, and grasslands gently swaying in the breeze. The sky was occasionally filled with the sound of birds chirping. New Zealand's landscapes were breathtaking. The vibrant green mountains and vast open fields made everyone feel at ease. Each time they passed a particularly beautiful view, the cars would stop for photos. Jack sat in the front passenger seat of the first car, trying to lose himself in the beauty of the scenery. "How do you like the view, Jack?" John, the driver, asked with a grin. Jack snapped out of his thoughts and smiled faintly. "It's incredible. Unlike anywhere we've flown over before, the mood in the car was light and carefree." Emily, sitting in the back, chatted with the others about their destination, a remote town known for its hot springs and hiking trails. "We could relax in the hot springs first, then hike to the summit to watch the sunset," Emily said, excitement evident in her voice. She had already mapped out all the routes and spots to visit. However, as the convoy continued along the winding road, traffic suddenly increased, and the two cars were separated. "Hey, where did the other car go?" Emily glanced out the rear window and noticed that the second car was no longer in sight. "They probably got stuck in traffic." "Don't worry, they know the destination. We'll meet them there," John replied, focusing on driving. Jack frowned. The unease he'd been feeling returned with full force. They were separated from the other car now, and that didn't sit right with him. He glanced at John, feeling like they should stop and wait. "Maybe we should pull over and wait for them," Jack suggested. "They'll catch up. We're almost there anyway. We can just meet them at the hot springs," John said nonchalantly. Jack didn't respond, only nodding. But deep down, he knew something bad was about to happen. The first car continued on, surrounded by beautiful scenery, but Jack could no longer enjoy it. After the vehicle split, the car Jack was in continued along the winding mountain roads. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled light onto the road. Yet, Jack's unease grew stronger with every passing mile. He gripped the armrest, his eyes scanning the road ahead and the forest beyond, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, John swerved the steering wheel sharply. The screech of tires filled the air as the car spun out of control. Inside the car, the passengers screamed as the vehicle flipped. Jack felt his body lurch violently to the side as the car collided with the rocks and the roadside barriers. With a thunderous crash, the car overturned. Time seemed to freeze. Jack's mind went blank as his body was held firmly by the seatbelt. The car tumbled before finally coming to a stop. Silence fell, save for the faint ringing in his ears. "Is everyone okay?" Jack croaked, struggling to regain his senses. Emily groaned from the back seat, blood trickling from her arm, but she appeared otherwise unhurt. John was pale but still alert, doing his best to stay calm. Miraculously, they had only sustained minor injuries. Sirens wailed in the distance as police cars and ambulances quickly arrived on the scene. Jack was helped out of the wreckage by paramedics. His heart raced as he surveyed the mangled vehicle. The car had been severely damaged, overturned by a large boulder. Though they were only lightly injured, the gravity of the situation left everyone shaken to their core. Jack and the other injured crew members were taken to a small local hospital. Though their injuries were minor, the weight of the situation hung heavily over them. The bright lights of the emergency room felt cold and sterile, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic. Emily sat on a hospital bed, her arm bandaged. Her eyes were vacant, clearly still in shock from the accident. John sat nearby, head down, saying nothing. Jack leaned against the wall, staring out the window. The setting sun bathed the sky in a blood-red hue, heightening his sense of unease. It was then that Michael Stone, their manager, arrived at the hospital, his face pale and filled with anxiety and grief. "Are you all okay?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning each of them. "We're fine, just minor injuries," Jack replied, though his voice was hoarse. Michael took a deep breath, as though steeling himself for what he was about to say. "I have some bad news. The other car, they had a severe accident. All 5 people. They didn't make it." The room fell into a deathly silence. Emily clasped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. John stood abruptly, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's impossible. We just separated. How could they?" His voice trembled with shock. Michael nodded grimly. "The police said the time of the accident was almost exactly the same as when yours happened. but in a different location. It's strange, to say the least. Jack felt dizzy, gripping the wall for support. He recalled the smiling faces of his colleagues before they had parted ways. How could they be gone so suddenly? When Michael returned from the police station to the hotel, his mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. Images of his colleagues' faces at the morgue, frozen in expressions of terror and disbelief, flashed before him. Then there was the eerie coincidence, 2 separate accidents in different locations, yet happening at the exact same time. When he got back to the hotel, Jack, Emily, and John were already waiting in the room. Though their physical injuries were minor, their spirits were shattered. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind outside the window. "Michael," Jack finally spoke, his voice low. "How are they? What did you find out at the station?" Michael sat down heavily, forcing himself to speak. His gaze moved across their faces before he said, "They're gone. All of them. The accident was sudden. There was nothing anyone could do." Once again, silence took over the room. Each of them wore the same expression: disbelief, grief, and a sense of dread. Jack clenched his fists, the growing suspicion and fear settling deep inside him. "There's more," Michael added, his voice hoarse. "The time of the accident. It was exactly the same as when ours happened. 3 o'clock sharp." His words landed like a heavy blow. Emily's eyes widened, her breathing quickened. John shook his head in denial, unable to accept the truth. "That's impossible," John whispered. "How could it be the same time? This is too strange." A few days later, the airline arranged a special flight to bring the victims' families to New Zealand for a memorial service and ritual. The plane touched down at the New Zealand airport, and one by one, the grieving family members disembarked. Their faces were filled with sorrow and disbelief as they came to terms with the sudden loss of their loved ones. Jack, Emily, and John stood at the airport's exit, watching silently as the families walked by. Guilt gnawed at them. They had survived by chance, but these families would never see their loved ones again. Michael approached the families, offering condolences with a calm voice, though inside, his unease only deepened. To help ease the family's grief and guide the souls of the departed, the airline arranged for a ritual to be held at a local temple. The ritual was to be conducted by a respected local priest with a deep knowledge of handling spiritual matters. The ceremony was set to take place at dusk, the time when the boundary between the living and the dead was said to be thinnest. The priest informed the families that each of them should carry a black umbrella. According to him, the umbrellas would serve as protection for the souls, helping them find their way home safely. Although puzzled, the families followed the priest's instructions, holding the umbrellas tightly as they prepared for the ritual. On the day of the ritual, the sky was overcast, thick clouds blocking out the sun, casting a gloomy atmosphere. Though the weather wasn't cold, everyone felt an unnatural chill in the air. The families stood outside the temple, clutching their black umbrellas, their faces marked with sorrow. The priest began chanting softly, the air thick with the scent of burning incense. Everyone stood in solemn silence, listening to the priest's words and reflecting on their loss. The ritual was solemn and heavy, the atmosphere suffocating, as if even the air had grown thick with grief. Tears flowed freely down the faces of the family members as they held onto their umbrellas, feeling as though it was their final connection to the departed. Jack, Emily, and the other surviving crew members stood quietly to the side, watching the ceremony with heavy hearts. The priest's chanting went on for a long time. Finally, as the last word was spoken, the ceremony came to an end. Though the sky remained overcast, the wind had calmed, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to ease, if only slightly. After the ritual, the families were still deeply immersed in grief, but some found a measure of peace. Though their loved ones were gone, they believed their souls could finally rest. The surviving crew and the families boarded a plane to return home. However, as they prepared to leave for the airport, one of the victim's family members noticed her black umbrella was missing. She had been holding it tightly after the ritual, but by the time they reached the airport, it had mysteriously vanished. "Where's my umbrella?" she asked, frantically searching through her luggage. No matter where she looked, it was nowhere to be found. The others helped search the airport, but they had no luck. She called the hotel, hoping it had been left behind, but the hotel staff said no umbrella had been found in her room. A sense of unease crept into the woman's heart, but with so few flights available, missing this one meant they'd be stuck in New Zealand. Despite her fear and sadness, she reluctantly boarded the plane, haunted by the missing umbrella. As the plane taxied down the runway, the surviving crew exchanged uneasy glances, each feeling a strange tension in the air. Especially after learning about the missing umbrella, it felt as though some unseen force was still at play. As the plane ascended into the sky, silence filled the cabin. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. The lost umbrella lingered in everyone's minds, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken. A few months after the return flight, the airline reassigned Jack, Emily, and the other surviving crew members to different routes. Though they no longer spoke of the accident, the shadow of that day lingered in their minds. Over the next few years, they occasionally heard strange stories from colleagues flying the New Zealand route. Some said that each time they arrived at the New Zealand airport, they saw a man in a crew uniform standing at the bus stop, holding a black umbrella and staring blankly ahead. He just stands there, not moving. His face is so pale it's like paper. His eyes are completely empty, one colleague described. It looks just like that crew member who died. Though these stories sent chills down their spines, Jack chose not to dwell on them. He had done his best to forget the tragic events and focus on his other duties. Years later, Jack was once again assigned to the New Zealand route. By then, the number of flights had increased, and passengers and crew alike had grown accustomed to the route. Jack believed that after all these years, he had finally put the tragedy behind him. However, the moment he arrived in New Zealand that night, old memories began flooding back. As the plane touched down under the cover of darkness, Jack disembarked and made his way to the airport bus stop. He tried to push away thoughts of the past, but a creeping chill settled into his bones as the evening breeze brushed his skin. The bus stop was eerily quiet, illuminated only by a few dim streetlights. Darkness pressed in from all sides, and it felt as though something was watching him from within the shadows. Jack's unease grew, and he instinctively stayed close to the small pool of light. Just as the bus arrived, Jack glanced across to the opposite bus stop. There, under the dim light, stood a man in a crew uniform, holding a black umbrella. Jack's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was eerily familiar, pale and expressionless, exactly like his colleague who had died all those years ago. Jack's heart raced. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the man, who stood perfectly still, his head slightly bowed, as if waiting for something. The black umbrella swayed gently in the breeze, casting an unnatural shadow. Jack's pulse quickened, cold sweat forming on his brow. He tried to convince himself it was just a hallucination, but the face and the black umbrella were too real to ignore. The roar of the bus's engine brought him back to reality. He climbed aboard, his body stiff with fear, but his gaze remained fixed on the man at the bus stop. The figure didn't move, as though time itself had frozen. As the bus pulled away, Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was still lurking in the darkness. Back at the hotel, Jack forced himself to calm down, telling himself it had all been in his imagination. But no matter how hard he tried, the image of that pale face and the black umbrella lingered in his mind. He couldn't help but remember the car crash and the missing umbrella, wondering if some unresolved mystery was still waiting to be uncovered. Lying in bed, Jack tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The ticking of the room's clock echoed loudly in the quiet night, each tick like a heavy weight pressing down on him. Outside, the wind howled, and Jack swore he could hear faint whispers carried on the breeze, just beyond his reach. Sometime after midnight, exhaustion finally pulled him into a restless sleep. But in his dreams, he was back at the airport bus stop, and the man with the black umbrella was still standing there, staring at him with those lifeless eyes. Jack woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat. The room was deathly silent. Instinctively, he rolled over in bed, But suddenly, he felt a presence in the room with him. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the air was thick with a damp, musty smell, as if something dark and foul was creeping closer. Jack's eyes shot open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Standing at the foot of his bed was the same man. He was still dressed in his crew uniform, gripping the black umbrella. Water dripped from the umbrella onto the carpet, making a faint tap, tap sound. The man's face was deathly pale, his eyes empty and hollow, as if all the life had been drained from him. Jack's heart pounded wildly, and he tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt like an invisible force was choking him, pinning him to the bed. His body was frozen with fear, his eyes locked on the ghostly figure. What do you want?" Jack managed to whisper, his voice trembling with terror. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, repeating the same words over and over. "I want to go home." The voice was low and mournful, filled with sorrow and despair, as though it came from another world. Jack's chest tightened, and a cold sweat covered his skin. He could feel the icy grip of fear wrapping around him, the weight of the ghostly presence suffocating him. "I want to go home." The man stood motionless at the foot of the bed, slowly lifting the umbrella as if offering it to Jack. The words echoed in the room, like a never-ending chant, growing louder and more insistent. Just as Jack felt his consciousness slipping away, the umbrella suddenly fell to the floor with a heavy thud, and the room fell silent once more. The next morning, Jack woke with a start. The room was as it had always been, but the terror of the night lingered like a dark shadow. The ghostly words, "I want to go home," echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. Jack knew that his colleague, the man with the black umbrella, would never find his way home. He would forever wander the airport bus stop, waiting for a journey that would never be completed. And that haunting memory would remain with Jack for the rest of his life, an unshakable shadow of fear. Thank you so much for watching until the end. We hope this story gave you chills and left you with more questions than answers. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Stay safe, and remember, some mysteries are best left unexplained. See you in the next story.